Well, good afternoon. I'm here with Annalie Alfonso. She's a family therapist, and I'm going to ask her a couple of questions to help us get through lockdown and survive it with all of the disappointments and the frustrations that we're experiencing here in Victoria, and we're sure across our country. So, Annalie, how are you first?
All right. Hanging in there.
You're in lockdown too.
That's right. So it depends on what hour of the day, what time of the day you ask me, but right now, not too bad.
That's good. All right. Well, I'm wondering if you could draw from your wisdom and experience and tell us maybe what are three things that will help us best get through lockdown? You know, if you were to say the top three things that will help you get through and survive this lockdown, what would they be?
Really good think about that, because that's really condensing it down, isn't it? But
yeah, I know there's
I
more
think
than three.
Yeah, but it's helpful because too much information, I think we're all fatigued, and too much helpful information can just go in one ear and out the other. So the three things I boiled it down to were look up. So shoring up some of the faith stuff that is going to underpin our days and our weeks and our months. And that is going back to God and to the things that we know are true about him. I think of, imagine your faith jar where you go back to the stones, to the things you've collected that have told the story of God's faithfulness in your life. Rummage through those and remind yourself that he is still at work and still can do some good stuff. But I think more importantly, it isn't just the airy-fairy idea of faith. Change stuff up. So in times of lockdown and in times of restrictions, we've got to get really creative about how we connect with God. And what was working may not be working now. So I'm thinking that with all the technology we've got at our fingertips, it's helpful to look at new ways to connect with him. And that could change even weekly as things ebb and flow and we get bored with something, or it's just not working for us. So change the way you pray. I like to pray straight into my PC sometimes. I close my eyes because I did typing back in the 80s, and I can just close my eyes and I pray as I type, as I pray, and then I read over it, and I'm fascinated by what comes flowing out of my heart and mind with God. And that's just a journal, it's just a Word document, date, time, and off it goes.
That's such a good idea. Can I say, if I was typing into my PC with my eyes shut, it would be like I was speaking in tongues because no words would make sense.
Well, look, whatever works.
Whatever works.
The other thing is grabbing your phone and recording your prayers and hearing them back, and knowing that in those moments, as your mind goes, as often Psalms do, where they start with a lament and then they finally move into a time of worship and remembering God is who he is, you can hear that back and keep a record of that. But more importantly, the reason I'm saying this stuff is if there's anyone out there like me, I can't just close my eyes and fold my hands for hours. I can't do that. I start doing lists. I fall asleep. I get really distracted. So things that are interactive for me work best. So whatever it is, change it up. You know, get online, watch a sermon from somewhere else, watch a Christian movie, connect with God in really creative ways, and change it up as you go, because these are tough times. And I think that what was working, if it isn't, then it won't. So do something different to connect.
Hey, can I tell you a secret? Maybe a secret after I tell you this. One of the things I've been doing in lockdown around changing up my faith is writing a story, like a faith story. And it actually allows me to reflect on my faith and what I believe about God and weave that into a story that's got nothing to do with me. But it's a really interesting way to be creative and to engage my faith.
Wonderful.
That
is wonderful.
Don't tell anyone, okay?
No, all right. I'll keep it between you and me. Well, there are a lot of really creative people out there, and it might be a painting that you do for God. It might be a children's story that you come up with for even your own children. How would you explain something? Just anything that, get out in nature, pray outside, pray, as you move. Find new ways to connect, and don't be afraid of doing that, because God can keep up.
Yeah, that's lovely. What else?
I think that the other one is one that's been really well researched in the world, in the secular world, as well as it's all over the Bible. The Bible's all over it in many, many ways, which is get about being kind. So finding your compassion and your kindness button, your generosity button, and triggering that into some action, even in small little things. Now, we did that last year. I think that it was a real movement in among Christians and non-Christians to be kind. But I think that COVID has hit us really hard this lockdown time, because we've run out of ideas and we're just boo-hooing. And that's fair enough.
We're boo-hooing.
We really are. But the research says that our brains actually change, that our feelings change, and then we have the endorphin release of acts of kindness. And so getting back into that and maybe finding new ways to do that is really helpful. So little things, if you've made a meal and it's abundant, split it, put it in a container, share it with a neighbour, write a note, pick some flowers, talk to a stranger, drop something off, order something. When you're at Coles or Woolies, pick up a voucher from that wall of cards and send something to someone in the mail. Write an old-fashioned letter. The expressions of kindness and generosity open up our hearts. And so it's this beautiful loop of not only doing us good in our hearts, but we're doing somebody else good. It often gets paid forward because I think kindness begets kindness, and it loops back to us. And somehow it shifts our mind enough to not see things as dark and bleak, because we've been kind somehow. I don't know how that works, but God kind of is all over it, and he's been on about it for a while, and science has caught up, and so everyone agrees it's a good thing. So get your kids in on it, do it yourself, remind yourself a text or something. Weed somebody's garden. Nobody's out
you can
there.
weed mine. No,
yeah.
No. Just
yeah.
It's a great idea. That's so
nice.
good.
It's nice. Yeah.
Now, have you got one more for us?
One more. Talk and walk and talk. So get together with people. Now, we know that, and we're only allowed to exercise as if that's a high priority. It's never been a high priority in my life. So I actually have to really try. But the problem is that movement, again, is an endorphin motivator, but in that time when we're talking, actually talk. So move around. So if you're talking to someone that you're not with, put your headphones in and go for a walk and actually express yourself. So putting things into words is incredibly vital for our well-being, for our mental health and our emotional health at this time. And what I mean is that you need to actually label stuff for what it is. And if you're sad, say you're sad, and be okay about that. But if you're like so many that don't want to burden, we live in a very polite society, especially Australians. You don't go around sort of airing your dirty laundry much. Start your conversation with a disclaimer saying, I don't need you to fix this. I'm just going to tell you how I'm feeling. So you disengage the person you're talking to from any responsibility of having to bear that burden other than the conversation that you have with them. That way you can fully explore how you're feeling and say so, and that it's okay. The world hasn't ended. You know that. They know that. And you've labelled it. There's something about putting it to words. I think that's why prayer works, even though it's a hard thing to do. I find it really hard. Is putting things into words is really important. It's not just thinking it and feeling it and expecting people to know, but actually saying them.
Yeah.
There's something.
So on that topic and sort of moving the conversation, I want to talk about two words, grief and anger, because we experience grief with what we have lost. So whether it's a birthday party, whether it's a special event, and Laura talked about this, lockdown lows, what you lose along the way. And we have grief, which sometimes we think, oh, it's weird that I'm grieving. It's just school, or it's just, a birthday party, or it's just, but we have grief. And additionally, we have anger, and not always are we able to speak about that anger. But then having said that, there's sometimes some anger that bubbles up, and on social media, we might express ourselves, or in the home we might feel frustrated and anger bubbles over. What do we do with our grief and our anger, Annalie, in the middle of this kind of a lockdown? Where do we go and how do we deal with it?
Really important two things, because I think they tie in together. And I'm going to talk about anger today as a secondary emotion, even though there is some research suggesting that it is a primary emotion, one of the big sort of 3 or 4. But I actually think it's an expression, a secondary expression, meaning there's something beneath it. So I'll start with anger, because anger, I think when it shows up, it's come to tell us something. And as a therapist, I actually look for anger in people who are grieving and upset, hurt, suffering, and in pain. If it hasn't shown up yet, I'm worried, because I think it's actually a really important emotion. But it isn't good if it becomes destructive. So I think that if anger has shown up and is staying, and it's here to stay with you, and other people have noticed, or it has become something that it has interrupted your relationships, sit down and ask it some questions, and ask it, where do you come from? What's underneath this anger? And try and tap into things like sadness, anxiety, worry, and fear. Those other 4 emotions are often the reason why we have anger. Anger is a much more powerful, and it's also full of action, and so it empowers us
in a sense, isn't it? Yeah,
exactly. The other ones can put us in a corner and we can stay there. Anger gets us out of that corner and start to fight. So it's not a bad thing, but in and of itself, if we haven't understood where it's come from, then that's not helpful. So it's asking yourselves, where is the emotion coming from, and what is my primary emotion? So who or what am I missing? What am I afraid of? What gets me in the bad mood? And then, importantly, what gets me out of bad mood? If you're really stuck in it, other people might have some advice on that, because they might know you a little better. And when you're angry, you can't see yourself out of that. But it's important to acknowledge it and talk to someone you trust to say, I'm feeling really angry, and acknowledging that is really important.
That's great. So I love that. Ask someone else what gets you out of it, because sometimes you're a bit close to the anger yourself to know. That's a really good extra little pick up there. Thank you. And what about grief? Because grief obviously is different, and in some ways we want to say it's not that bad, it's worse in the world, all those kind of things, but we still are experiencing grief in this time. So what do you think? Where do we go with that?
I think grief at this time is really important to understand how complicated it's become, because we've got disenfranchised grief or ignored grief, which means that we are grieving loads of small things, but we're not allowed to say that we're grieving them because they're not important enough, because you can't compare it to Afghanistan and Haiti, because you can't compare it to people who have lost their jobs. But they are losses and griefs in and of themselves, and they need to be acknowledged. We're not robots. And what happens in times like this that we're going through right now is that they accumulate. So it is a lot of small little things that have hurt us, that we've lost along the way, things that haven't been what we would hope them to be, that are just starting to catch up with us. And then they may not in and of themselves be very big, but they are suddenly big because they've joined up.
It's a weight of grief when you've got so many in your bag.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you think that there are things that we can do to help us grieve? I mean, I know people can do cathartic things like watch a sad movie and they have a cry, and it actually helps tap into that stuff. Or maybe there are other things, but do you have any suggestions of what we could do to help us grieve?
Yeah. The walking, talking thing that I mentioned as the 3 best things are really, really helpful. Acknowledging safe people that you can trust with the information that you have, and putting some boundaries around that conversation, so it doesn't go endlessly and it also doesn't burden, and putting some action around those afterwards, and maybe even being accountable to what you decide between you and a trusted person you're going to do about it. Naming it and actually spending time either in quiet quietly with yourself is really important, whether it be in nature. Some people do it the best stuff in the shower, any alone time in which you can name it. And I think writing those down is really important so that you can see what it is that you have lost. Spending time with things that matter and creating some space for those times that matter. Looking through a photo album and sitting with a favourite photo of someone that you miss or have missed is really important. So to have a cry about it and acknowledge the loss of those things, whether even it be a birthday or the birth of a family member, those things are really important to acknowledge and say. And having some ceremony about some things. So not just saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter, birthdays don't matter, or it doesn't matter, you know, that was just a job promotion. It didn't matter that I didn't have my family dinner with it. But actually creating some ceremony around that and you know, doing a toast, lighting a candle. You mentioned those things before, but they're actually really, really helpful because we're giving meaning to things that can just drain out of our lives without acknowledgement and validation. You know, whether you write something beautiful, a poem, people write their sadnesses down and then, you know, put them in the fireplace and say goodbye to them. And lay them to rest, as it were, turn them, you know, into the ashes, then put those ashes into your garden and plant a new plant. Those kind of full circle moments where you are acknowledging what has been, what you felt about it, and what you have done about it is really important to walk that through. It is a valley walk, but it's a really important one. If we jump out and we try and pretend that it's not happening or that we're not feeling that heaviness, it catches up.
You kind of take the bones with you, don't you? If you don't leave them in the valley, they come with you wherever you are, and you're still carrying them around, and they're weighty. They really weigh you down over long periods of time. Hey, Annalie, I'm so grateful for your time in just sharing some of that stuff, reminding us in the middle of this time there are things that we can do that help us live well. And we really trust that, you know, God says that he's got wisdom in his word that help us live through every season. And you are filled with God's words and filled with his wisdom and sharing that with us. And so I'm really grateful. I know there'll be lots of people that'll find this life-giving conversation. And so we're going to share it with everybody. And don't forget to send through your thanks to Annalie if there's something that stood out to you. Send it through to the office and we'll look after it. But for the rest of the day, Annalie, we wish you really well. We hope you have a fantastic day, and we're so grateful for your time and your wisdom. And we say go in peace.
Thank you. Blessings.